made to eat off the floor for 7 long years. A cowboy sat her at his table and gave her a silver spoon. The spoon was my grandmother's. I don't know why I'm starting there, but that's where it starts. That spoon. Sterling, gone dark at the bowl, the handle worn thin on one side where she used to hold it against her thumb when she stirred. My mother kept it wrapped in a square of flannel inside the kitchen drawer. And when she died, she left it to me, and I kept it the same way she did, wrapped, in the drawer. Because I had no use for a single silver spoon on a cattle spread where I ate alone most nights, and the only thing on my table that caught any light was the lantern. I am 61 years old. I have worked this land since I was 19. I have buried a wife, Cora, gone 12 years now from a fever that came fast and left no time for goodbyes, and I have raised a son who went east to study law and writes me letters I answer badly. I have 3 hands who have been with me long enough that we don't have to talk much to understand each other. I have a cattle operation that is not big but is sound. I have never, in all of that, thought of myself as a man with much to offer a woman. I was past the age when men think about such things, or I told myself I was. A man gets comfortable in his solitude after long enough. It starts to feel like a decision he made rather than something that simply happened to him. All of that is how things were in the fall of 1883, when I rode into Milligan's Creek with 2 of my hands to pick up wire fencing and a new set of rigging, and I saw a woman sitting in the dirt outside the harness shop with a split lip and no shoes. I'm going to tell this right, which means I am not going to rush it, because the thing that happened between her and me did not happen fast, and it would be a lie to tell it like it did. What I can say is that what I felt, riding past and then pulling up and turning my horse back around, was not soft. It was not tenderness right away. What it was, and I want to be honest about this, was a kind of cold fury so sudden it surprised me. The same way you feel when you come around a bend and find a wire fence cutting across range that was open since before any of us were born. Not grief, not pity, just wrong. This is wrong. Someone made this wrong, and I am going to make it right. Her name was Vera Nell Dodd, 38 years old, though she looked older that morning, which I understand better now than I did then. Brown hair gone dry, cheekbones too sharp, hands that were red and cracked across the knuckles from work. She was sitting with her back against the harness shop wall, and she was holding a burlap sack on her lap like it contained something valuable. And when I stepped down off my horse, she looked at me the way you look at something coming toward you when you can't yet tell if it means you harm. I said, "You all right?" She said, "Yes, sir." I said, "You're not." She looked at me a moment. She had gray eyes, darker at the rim. She said, "I can manage." I said, "I didn't ask if you could manage. I asked if you were all right." She didn't answer that, which was its own kind of answer. My hand Dutch was standing back by the horses. He was wise enough not to say anything. I crouched down to her level and I looked at her lip, which had been split recently and badly enough to need stitching, and at her feet, which were bare on the cold ground, and I said, "Where are your shoes?" She said, "I don't have any at the moment." I said, "Where are you sleeping tonight?" She said she didn't know yet. I'm going to stop here and say something plain. There are men who would have asked the questions a person asks when they want to know what kind of woman they're dealing with before they decide if she deserves help. I didn't ask those questions. Not because I'm a saint, I'm not close to a saint, but because I have been alive long enough to know that a woman sitting barefoot in the dirt with a split lip is not a woman you interrogate about her circumstances before you feed her. The circumstances can wait. The dirt and the cold and the empty stomach, those things are now. I said to Dutch, "Go get the wagon and bring it up front." I helped her up. She was careful not to lean on me more than she had to, which told me something about what kind of person she was underneath the damage. I walked her into the dry goods store, which was the nearest place, and I bought her a pair of good leather boots. She told me her size in a voice so quiet I had to ask her to say it again, and a heavy coat that was hanging on a peg near the door. She protested both, which I ignored. Then I walked her to the diner on the main street, and I sat her down, and I ordered her a plate of eggs and salt pork and biscuits and a cup of coffee, and I sat across from her with my own coffee, and I waited. She ate not fast, not like a hungry person lets themselves eat when someone is watching. Careful and measured, which was worse somehow than if she'd been ravenous, like she'd learned not to trust that the plate would stay in front of her. When she was done, I said, "Now, tell me where you came from if you want to." She looked out the window for a moment. Then she said, "I was the housekeeper for Emmett Galt's ranch, 7 years. I knew Galt, Most people in 3 counties knew Galt. He was the kind of man who wore his wealth like a weapon and treated everyone below him like furniture that needed occasional discipline to stay in place. I had heard things about how he ran his household. I had not, before that moment, known the specifics. She told me some of them, not all. I don't think she told anyone all of them, ever. But enough that by the time she was done I had my hands flat on the table, because otherwise I would have had them in fists, and that didn't seem like the right thing to do in front of her. 7 years. She had come there as a widow, her husband dead of a fall from a horse, with nothing and nowhere, and Galt had offered her work. Housekeeping, cooking, cleaning. She had a small room off the kitchen. She was paid a wage that he routinely found reasons to reduce. She was not permitted to eat at the table with the family. She ate in the kitchen, standing, or not at all when she had committed some infraction of the household rules, which were numerous and shifted often enough that she never quite knew what was permitted. She stopped before she got to the split lip. I didn't ask her to keep going, I knew enough. I said, "Where is the rest of your things?" She said she had what was in the burlap sack. I said, "All right." Then I sat with that for a moment, and then I said, "I have a ranch 12 miles east. I have a spare bedroom that's been closed since my son went east. My cook is an old man named Potts who can't manage the house along with the kitchen anymore and has been telling me so for 2 years. I'm not Emmett Galt. My hands eat at the same table I do. My house is plain, but it's warm and it's yours if you want a position." She looked at me for a long time. I could see her working through it. A woman who has been somewhere bad for 7 years does not just decide to trust the next man who offers her a roof. She has too many reasons not to. She said, "What would you expect of me?" I said, "The house, the cooking if you're willing, your own time on Sunday. Fair wages paid every month, nothing else." She said, "Nothing else." I said, "Nothing else. I'm a plain man, I mean what I say." She sat with that, then she said, "All right." That's how it began. I want to be clear that it did not begin as anything other than what I said it was. She came to the ranch and I showed her the bedroom and I left her alone. Potts was skeptical. He's skeptical of most new arrangements. But within a week, she had the kitchen running in a way it hadn't run since Cora was alive, and within 2 weeks Potts had decided she was acceptable, which from him was high praise. She was quiet and she worked without being told twice, and she kept to herself in a way that I respected because I keep to myself the same way. The first time she ate at the table with me was the second night. I set a place for her and she came in from the kitchen and stood in the doorway looking at it like there might be a mistake. I said, "That's your place." She sat down. We ate without saying much. It was a decent meal. She had made a pot roast with root vegetables that smelled like something I'd forgotten could exist in this house. I ate 3 helpings and didn't apologize for it. After supper, I got out the flannel square from the drawer, and I unwrapped the silver spoon, and I put it next to her coffee cup. She looked at it, she looked at me. I said it was my grandmother's. I've got no use for it on my own. It ought to be used. She picked it up and turned it over in her fingers. She said, "It's beautiful." I said, "It's just a spoon." She looked at me again, and there was something in her face that I didn't quite know how to read then. I understand it better now. She set the spoon down very gently, like it was something that could be taken back, like she was still waiting for the catch. There was no catch. I wasn't clever enough to have a catch. The weeks moved on. October went hard into November, and the cold settled in for real. I had a fence line problem in the north pasture that took most of 3 days to fix, and when I came in on the 3rd evening frozen through and favoring my left hand where I'd caught it wrong on a wire, she met me at the door with a look that was all business, and she sat me at the kitchen table, and she looked at the hand, and she cleaned it with carbolic and wrapped it, and she did not make a fuss about it, but she also did not pretend it wasn't there, which I appreciated. I thanked her. She said, "It's a bad cut. You should have stopped sooner." I said, "Probably." She almost smiled, not quite. I noticed her hands doing that, how they'd healed some in the weeks since she'd been eating properly. Still rough. A housekeeper's hands are always rough, but not cracked the way they'd been. She had good hands, capable. I thought about those hands on Galt's floors, and I put the thought away because it wasn't useful. What I noticed over those weeks was that she was watching me, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, in a way that was more like she was learning something, measuring something, like a person who's been told a fact 100 times and is finally seeing if the fact is actually true. I'm not a gentle man in the way some men are. I don't smooth things over. I say what I think and I expect the same back. But I have never once in my life lifted a hand to a woman, and the idea of it is so far outside how I understand myself that it doesn't even present itself as a choice to refuse. It simply does not exist, and I think she was watching to see that. Watching to see if the table was real, if the spare bedroom was real, if the wages, which I paid on the first of every month without her having to ask, were real. She was watching to see if I was real. In November, I went to town to settle an account at the feed store, and on my way back I stopped at Galt's place. I want to be clear that she didn't ask me to. She didn't know I did it. I went alone and I rode up to the main house, and Galt came out on the porch, and I told him plainly that the woman who had worked for him was now in my employ, and that if he had any intention of making trouble about it, he would find me standing between him and her, and that I would remain standing there for as long as it took. I told him I'd heard things about how he ran his house, and that the next time I heard them from a different woman, I would take it to the county sheriff. I wasn't loud about any of this. I was just clear. He said she was a thieving liar, and I said, demonstrate it in court or don't say it to me again. He didn't say anything after that. I turned my horse around and rode home. I didn't tell her about that visit for some time. When I did tell her, it was deep in winter by then. One evening by the fire, she went very still. She said, "You went there." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because it needed doing." She looked at me for a moment, and then she looked at the fire and she said, quietly, "No one has ever done that for me." I didn't know what to say to that. I said, "Well, he needed to know." She nodded once and didn't say anything more, and I didn't either. But she reached over and she put her hand on my forearm, just for a moment, and then she took it away and we sat with the fire. That was December. By January, she had rearranged the kitchen in a way that made Potts initially furious and eventually grateful. She had taken down the moth-eaten curtains in the front room and replaced them with a plain, heavy cloth she'd sewn herself that kept the drafts out properly. She had put a vase on the table, just a tin one she'd found in the back of the pantry with dried grasses in it, because there was nothing to cut in January. Small things, but the house felt different. It felt inhabited in a way it hadn't for years. Like something had stopped holding its breath. I noticed I was sleeping better. I noticed I was less sharp with my hands over small things. I noticed that supper had become the part of the day I looked forward to, which was not something I had looked forward to for a long time. I did not, through any of that, let myself think beyond what was true. She was my housekeeper. She was a woman who had been badly used and needed a stable place. The last thing she needed was the man who employed her making assumptions. I was careful about that. I was careful the way you are careful around something that matters enough that you'd rather do without it than damage it. February brought a hard storm that kept us all inside for 4 days. On the second day, Potts came down with a chest cough that put him in his bed, and Vera Nell managed the kitchen alone and fed the hands and came to check on Potts in the evenings with hot broth and a no-nonsense manner that made him more compliant than he'd been about any illness in the 20 years I'd known him. On the third day, with the wind so loud we had to raise our voices in the kitchen, she asked me to help her take down the storage boxes from the high shelf above the pantry so she could reorganize them. I stood on the step stool and handed them down one by one, and when I handed her the last one, heavier than it looked, our hands met on the box, and we stood there a moment longer than the task required. I stepped down, she set the box on the counter. She didn't turn around right away. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Go ahead." She said, "Why did you stop that day in town? You didn't know me. A lot of men would have kept writing." I thought about that. I said, "Because it was wrong and I was there." She said, "That's all." I said, "That's enough, isn't it?" She turned around, her gray eyes the darker rim around them. She said, "Most men I have known would want something back for what you've done." I said, "I told you from the start what I wanted." She said, "A housekeeper." I said, "Yes." She said, "And that's still all." I said, "I didn't say that." She went quiet. I said, "I'm not going to make any assumptions about what you want. I've been alive long enough to know better than to do that. I'm telling you what I feel because it seems like you deserve to know it, and then it's yours to do what you want with." She looked at me for a long time. The wind was going hard outside and the lamp was flickering slightly the way it does in a draft. She said, "I have spent 7 years being owned. I don't know yet how to trust something that doesn't cost me anything." I said, "I know," and I said, "I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to decide anything." She nodded. She turned back to the boxes. I went to check on Potts. That was February. March came. The storm memory faded the way they do, and the work picked up again, and we were back to the rhythm of the ranch. But something had shifted in the way we were with each other. Not large, just less distance than before. She would say something at supper that was a joke, dry and quick, and I would laugh. And there was something good in that, just a woman making me laugh over a plate of food. She started asking me things about the land, the pasture conditions, the cattle, what I'd seen in such and such draw, not because she had any use for it, but because she was curious, and I found I liked explaining the land to a person who listened like it mattered. One evening in late March, she came to the door of the study while I was going over the accounts, and she said she needed to show me something. I followed her to the kitchen, and she had made something I hadn't had since I was a child, a vinegar pie, which is what women made in lean times when there were no proper fruit preserves. My mother had made them. I had not thought about them in 30 years. She set a piece in front of me and watched me take the first bite, and I sat there for a moment with it, and I didn't say anything for a bit. I said, "How did you know?" She said, "Potts mentioned your mother used to make them." I said, "You made this for me?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Why?" And she looked at me plainly and said, "Because I wanted to." I put my fork down. I said, "Vera." She said, "Yes." I said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you say, nothing changes. Your position here doesn't change. My feelings toward you don't change. Do you understand?" She said, "Yes." I said, "I would like to court you. If you're willing. If you're not, we'll eat the pie and I won't mention it again." She looked at the pie. She looked at me. She said, "You sure about that? A woman with my history." I said, "I'm courting the woman sitting in my kitchen who made me a vinegar pie. The rest of it is just what happened to her before she got here." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right." I said, "All right, you'll let me court you." She said, "All right." I picked my fork back up. She sat down across from me and cut herself a piece too, and we ate the rest of the pie. I am going to say something here that is important and that I want to be honest about. I was not a romantic man. I didn't know how to be romantic, and at 61 years old I was not going to learn how to bring flowers and write poems. What I did, and what I think she needed, which was different, was simply continue being exactly what I had been. I kept paying her wages on the first of the month. I kept treating her the same in front of my hands as I did when we were alone. I kept her room. I asked her things and listened to the answers, and I argued with her when I thought she was wrong about something, which was not infrequently, and she argued back, which I found I liked more than I could explain. There was a particular argument we had about when to move the cattle to the south pasture. She had been watching the grass and had an opinion, and she was right, which I told her. And she looked at me for a moment after I said that like she was waiting for the qualification that wasn't coming. She said, "You just said I was right." I said, "Because you were." She looked out the window. She said, quietly and mostly to herself, "Lord." Spring came in full, and the work was relentless and good. She was out of the house more. She'd started helping with the kitchen garden that Potts had always meant to expand and never had, and she had a way with growing things that surprised me, though I'm not sure why it should have. She wore an old hat of mine that she'd found hanging on the peg by the back door, too big for her, and she didn't ask permission, she just put it on, and every time I saw her in it, I felt something I wasn't going to try to name. In May, my son came west to visit for a week. He is a careful, thoughtful young man, my Thomas, nothing like me in some ways and exactly like me in others. He saw within an hour of arriving that something had changed in the house, and he saw what had changed it, and after the first supper, which Vera Nell made and at which she sat at the table as she always did, he took me aside and he said, "Father, I want to ask you something and I want you to tell me the truth." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "Are you happy?" I said, "Yes." He looked at me for a moment, that careful, reading look he has, and he said, "Good. That's all I wanted to know." And he went to find Vera Nell and he talked to her for a long time on the porch, and whatever they said to each other, I didn't ask. That evening she came in from the porch with color in her face that might have been the cold air, and she said, "Your son is a good man." I said, "He is." She said, "He gets it from somewhere." I let that stand. The evening before Thomas left, I was in the barn doing a last check on a heifer that had been off her feed, and I heard the door and Vera Nell came in with a lantern. She came over and stood beside me at the stall, and she looked at the heifer and she said, "Is she all right?" I said, "I think so, just picky." She stood there a moment and then she said, without looking at me, "I want to tell you something." I waited. She said, "I spent 7 years believing that the way things were was the way things were. That I had used up whatever luck I had and the rest of it was just going to be what it was." She stopped. I waited. She said, I want you to know that I know what you've done, not just the house or the wages. I know what it costs a man to go to a person like Galt and stand in his yard and say what you said. I know what it costs to mean what you say every single day for 8 months when you don't have to. I know that, and I want you to know that I know it. I looked at her in the lantern light, her hat, my hat, pulled down against the cold, the heifer moving softly in the stall. I said, you don't owe me anything for any of that. She said, I know I don't, that's not what I'm saying. She looked at me then, full on. She said, I'm saying I see you, the man you are. And I am not going anywhere. I'm not going to try to describe what that was like to hear. I'm 61 years old and I've had a hard and quiet life, and I'd been a long time since anyone had said anything like that to me or meant it like that. Cora, God rest her, knew me, but she knew me when I was young and there was still some hope visible on me. Vera Nell knew me as I actually was. Used up and plain and set in my ways and past the age when men expect to be seen. She saw me anyway. I reached over and I pulled her clothes. She came without hesitation. She turned her face up to mine, and I held her for a long time in that cold barn with the lantern going and the heifer watching us with her large, dumb eyes. And I thought about my grandmother's spoon in the kitchen drawer, and how my mother kept it wrapped in flannel, and how I'd lived alone long enough that I forgot what it meant to have something worth taking out and using. We were married in June. It was not a large wedding. Dutch and the other hands, Potts grumbling in a clean shirt, Thomas standing up with me, and a woman named Arlene who'd become Vera Nell's friend in town. The preacher said the words and I said mine, and she said hers in a clear, steady voice that did not waver. And afterward we came back to the ranch and Potts had made a meal, and we ate at the long table with all the hands, and it was loud in a way the house almost never was, and I sat at the head of it and looked down the table at her. And she was laughing at something Dutch had said, laughing with her whole face, and I thought, this is what the house was waiting for. This is what I was waiting for, and I didn't know it because I had stopped being the kind of man who expected anything. She caught me looking, and she raised her glass across the table, just slightly, just for me. I raised mine back. That night after everyone had gone, I was at the table, and she came out from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee, and she set them down, and she sat across from me, and she put the silver spoon next to her cup the way she always did now. She picked it up and turned it in her fingers the way she had that first night, and she said, you know what I thought the first time you put this out? I said, what? She said, I thought you were going to take it back. I said, why would I do that? She said, because that's what things were, before. I looked at her, the lamplight on her face, the spoon in her hand. I said, you know that's not how things are now. She looked at me, her gray eyes the darker rim. She said, yes, I know that now. Outside the window, the night was still. The land was quiet the way it gets after a good day, not empty, just at rest. 12 miles of range in every direction, all of it mine, all of it familiar, and this woman at my table who had come to me out of the dirt with nothing, and was now the center of everything that mattered in this house. She stirred her coffee with a silver spoon. I drank mine and didn't say anything. That was enough, that was more than enough.